The life of the great writer is shrouded in mysticism and secrets, starting with his birth and ending with his mysterious death, the reasons for which are still unclear. Few people know that the author of Dead Souls did not come from a noble family at all, and the surname Gogol originally did not belong to Nikolai Vasilyevich. Who was he really? Why throughout his life next to him was not a woman? Was he a madman or just had a unique sense of humor? About all this, in our today's story. The real name of the writer is Nikolai Yanovsky. He was born on March 20, 1809 in the village of Sorokinsy, Poltava province. He received the surname Gogol thanks to the machinations of his grandfather, Afanasy Demyanovich, who went to the trickery to elevate his social position. Afanasy Demjanovich, being the son of a priest, was characterized not only by education, but also by enterprise. Thanks to his persistence and dexterity, he managed to marry the daughter of a Bunchuk comrade, but this marriage was considered unequal. To eliminate the difference in status, he decided to go for forgery. With the help of money and clever manipulations, he forged his family tree, writing in it the legendary Cossack Colonel Ostap Gogol. Thus, he received a certificate of nobility and changed his surname to a double one, Gogol Yanovsky. At birth, Nicholas was recorded under the surname Yanovsky, but when he was 14 years old, he was officially recognized as a nobleman, and he was assigned the surname Gogol Yanovsky. However, after a year, the future writer decided to abandon the second part of the surname, which reminded of his noble origin, and remained simply Gogol. Nikolai Vasilyevich was the third child in the family, but the first to survive. His mother, being pregnant, made a vow, if a son is born, to name him in honor of Nicholas. So was born a man who was destined to become one of the most enigmatic figures of Russian literature. Of the 12 children born into the Gogol family, only 5 survived. Psychiatrist Grigory Saigan described the future writer. Nicholas was a child of gold, but weak and sickly. Skinny, with narrow shoulders, sunken chest, with an eternally pale, never had a healthy blush face. Nikolai's father, Vasily Afanasyevich, was a middle-class landowner. In his youth, he was fond of theater and literature, tried himself as an actor and writer, but did not achieve great success. However, those around him considered him a talented storyteller with a great sense of humor. It was from him that Gogol inherited a love of art, vivid imagination, and a penchant for mysticism. Since childhood, Nikolai Vasilyevich was prone to imagination, looked for various diseases, believed in predestined fate and miracles. Even his marriage was shrouded in mysticism. At the age of 14, he dreamed of a girl who, as he felt, was to become his wife. Waking up, he went to visit his acquaintance Kasarovsky and saw there their 1-year-old daughter Masha. Since then he called her his bride and, without waiting for her adulthood, made her an offer. When Masha was 14 years old, Vasily Afanasyevich was 28. Despite this age difference, their marriage was happy and lasted until Vasily's death. Few people know, but Gogol began his literary career as a poet and was sure that it was poetry, his true calling. In June 1829, he published his poem Hans Kuckelgarten, signing himself with the pseudonym Malov. However, the critics met the work extremely coldly. The reviews were so harsh that Gogol, who was severely affected by the criticism, went into a rage. He bought up all the unsold copies of the book and burned them, deciding not to engage in poetry anymore. He wrote most of his famous works in his youth. By 25 years from under his pen came out almost all those works that later became classics of Russian literature. This period became for Gogol the most productive in his literary career. In 1835, Pushkin gave him an idea, which later formed the basis of the great poem Dead Souls. Inspired by this idea, the writer immediately set to work. However, the creation of Dead Souls turned out to be a complicated process for him. Gogol repeatedly rewrote individual episodes, vainly trying to find the perfect words, to bring the work to perfection. Despite all the difficulties, in 1841 he completed the first volume. Initially, Gogol conceived Dead Souls as a 3-volume work, in structure reminiscent of Dante's Divine Comedy. In the first volume, the characters found themselves in a kind of hell, where their vices became the main subject of the narrative. The second volume was to be purgatory, in which Chichikov and Plyushkin went through trials that could lead them to change. And the third volume was to show their spiritual and moral transformation, a kind of paradise where souls were freed from sins. However, the fate of dead souls turned out differently. Only the first volume reached the readers. The second, despite its complete readiness, Gogol burned it several times, and it never survived. Domestic psychiatrist Vladimir Fedorovich Chiz, in his work Diseases of Gogol, analyzed the writer's work from the point of view of psychiatry of his time. In his opinion, the predisposition to mental disorder manifested itself in Gogol in childhood, but the disease finally developed 10 years before his death. It was during this period that he first destroyed the second volume of Dead Souls. Chiz also noted that this same time period coincides with Gogol's creative decline and his increasingly deepening retreat into religion. Indeed, in the last years of his life, he produced nothing of significance. Among his late works are the author's Confession, Selected Places from Correspondence with Friends, and the Divine Liturgy, texts of interest only to a narrow circle of readers. Gogol's contemporaries noted that he was an extremely nervous person, prone to deep feelings, which may have predetermined his complicated fate. Gogol's habits seemed not only strange, but also amusing, but none of his contemporaries considered him mentally ill or having serious mental disorders. Like his father, Nikolai Vasilyevich was a man of extreme imagination, prone to anxiety and constant fears for his health. The writer's biographer Quinty Veresev described him in his memoirs. In Paris, Gogol often fell into a depressing moodiness. He suddenly began to imagine that he was suffering from a serious illness, and most often feared for his stomach. His anxiety became so compulsive that it was hard and sad to be around him. To dissuade him in the imaginary terrible ailments was not possible. The writer really often complained of digestive problems and was treated by Dr. Marlin. He strictly followed his recommendations, which was given to him with difficulty, because Gogol loved delicious food and especially sweet. In addition, he did not like noisy companies and large crowds of people. Actor Alexander Tolchanov recalled a case when the writer was invited to one of the social evenings, but the organizers decided in advance not to invite too many guests, so as not to create discomfort for him. At about 8 o'clock in the evening, Gogol came. Entering the room and seeing so many unfamiliar faces, he was visibly embarrassed. When he was introduced to those present, he became completely confused. When he saw me, a man with whom he was already acquainted, he quickly approached and with obvious nervous tension began to shake my hand, which in turn confused me. Nevertheless, in a narrow, cozy circle of friends, Gogol could loosen up. In such companies, he willingly told jokes, poisoned jokes, and amused others. Among his oddities was one very remarkable habit: to roll small balls of breadcrumbs. Friends even joked about it, calling it a passion for rolling bread balls. Translator Nikolai Berg recalled that Gogol had an unusual habit. He either walked around the room, thinking, or sat at the table and wrote, while never ceasing to roll small balls out of white bread. The writer claimed that this activity helps him to concentrate and solve the most difficult problems. If Gogol became bored during dinner, he continued rolling bread balls and, unnoticed by others, tossed them into the kvass or on the plates of those sitting next to him. Another unusual side of his personality was needlework. Since childhood, Gogol mastered embroidery, knitting on needles, as well as skillful cutting and sewing clothes. This hobby accompanied him throughout his life, although he himself was often embarrassed by it. Dmitri, son of the historian Pogodin, in whose house Gogol lived for a long time, said, "For us children, it was strange to see how a man whom everyone considered a great writer could spend whole mornings knitting. Once I, laughing, asked him to knit me wool stockings, which he got angry and even kicked my ears." The main woman in Gogol's life was Alexandra Osipovna Smirnova-Rossett, who was admired by many famous contemporaries, including Zhukovsky, Lermontov, and other writers. Her wit, observation, subtle humor, and attractive appearance conquered admirers, but Gogol, unlike other cavaliers, never tried to get close to her physically. Their relationship remained exclusively platonic. When once Alexandra Osipovna cautiously started a conversation about the possibility of a closer relationship, Gogol was embarrassed, ran out of the room, and did not appear for 3 days. After this incident, she did not bring up the subject again, although she was very worried about the resulting discord. A year later, Alexandra married a wealthy businessman Smirnov, and the couple moved to Kaluga. In spite of this, Gogol often visited her, living in an outbuilding not far from their house. She was one of the few people to whom he entrusted to read some chapters of his manuscripts. Gogol was never married. He did not feel adapted to family life and did not consider it necessary to bind himself to the bonds of marriage. However, one day he did propose to Princess Anna Mikhailovna Vilgorsky, daughter of Louise Karlovna Baron. The Vilgorsky family accepted Gogol with warmth, appreciated his talent and originality. The writer became especially close to his youngest daughter, Anna Mikhailovna, who was nicknamed Nosy among her relatives for her outstanding facial features. Anna was not considered a beauty, but perhaps this is what brought her closer to Gogol, who himself often suffered from complexes about his appearance. Anna knew Gogol from the age of 8, and they established a trusting, almost familial relationship. When Anna Mikhailovna Vilgorskaya was 20 years old, she was literally bewitched by Gogol. In 1849, Nikolai Vasilyevich, using the mediation of Veniamin Vitov, the husband of Anna's older sister, made her an offer. However, such a noble family could not afford to be related to the writer, despite his fame. Among the women with whom Gogol had a particularly warm relationship, Ekaterina Komiakova, wife of the philosopher Alexei Komiakov and sister of the poet Nikolai Yazykov, stood out. Despite the writer's eccentricities and caprices, she accepted him as he was. Their friendship lasted for many years, and Gogol highly appreciated their spiritual connection, which meant much more to him than love relations. When Ekaterina Komiakova, expecting her 8th child, fell seriously ill, Gogol took it as a punishment from heaven. Her death shook him to the depths of his soul. He said that for him everything is over, finally fell into fear of death, completely abandoned literary activity. Once, during night prayers, he heard voices predicting his imminent death. A month after the death of a close friend, Nikolai Vasilyevich was gone. All his relations with women remained exclusively platonic. According to the doctor who took care of him in the last days of his life, Gogol never felt a physical need for intimacy and did not feel any pleasure from it. Friends of the writer believed that he deliberately refused romantic ties, so as not to squander his talent and luck. However, modern researchers put forward other versions. Thus, literary scholar and historian of literature Semyon Karlinsky suggested that Gogol may have experienced oppressed homosexual feelings. His deep religiosity and desire for moral purification made him avoid any manifestation of sinful thoughts. He sought deliverance from his inner contradictions through strict asceticism, including long fasts, refraining from sleep and food, which eventually led to his death. However, Karlinsky's theory remains only a hypothesis and has no documentary evidence. In the last 11 years of his life, Gogol slept exclusively sitting up, and no entreaties could make him lie down. This strange habit was related to his panic fear of being buried alive. In the last decades, he repeatedly told his friends, "Don't bury my body until there are clear signs of decomposition." He explained this by the fact that during his illness he experienced attacks of complete stupor, the heart and pulse freeze, creating the illusion of death. Gogol had always been a deeply religious man, but with the exacerbation of the disease his faith turned into a fanatical adherence to spiritual practices. Every day he read morning and evening prayers, chapters from the Gospel, the Apostolic Epistles, and the Old Testament. "Without prayer I begin nothing," he repeated to his friends. His last work was Reflections on the Divine Liturgy, published after his death. Gogol never had a permanent home. He lived in rented apartments, visited friends, constantly changing addresses. The last refuge for him was the house of Count Alexei Tolstoy, where he spent the last 5 years of his life and where he died. It was here, shortly before his death, that he destroyed the manuscripts of the 2nd volume of Dead Souls. The servant Semyon, seeing Gogol throwing precious papers into the fire, was shocked. "What are you doing?" he exclaimed. But the writer only glumly replied, "None of your business." He continued to burn manuscripts, and when the last sheet turned to ashes, sighed bitterly and cried. 10 days later, on February 21, 1852, Nikolai Vasilyevich died. He was only 42 years old. The next day, February 22nd, Friends and admirers carried Gogol's coffin from Tolstoy's house to the university church. The road was illuminated with torches, and at the coffin was posted a guard of honor of 6 students, changing every 2 hours. I want to apologize in advance for any errors in the text or voiceover. I am still learning, and the channel language is not my native language. The voiceovers are done by artificial intelligence, so if you notice any inaccuracies, please let me know so I can fix them and improve the quality of the content. I'd also welcome your feedback and thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments motivates me to keep finding new and exciting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss new stories.